So music is probably, no, most definitely one of the more divisive topics on the internet. Second only to, of course, well, politics. But in an odd sort of way, it can be considerably more constructive considering it's just music, right? But it has the ability to make even the most polarizing views connect in a single way, if established opinions are offended, making them unify, even if for a brief moment. Yeah, politics become irrelevant the moment you trash weed in a room full of weed enjoyers. And this represents the newest culture around music and how it has transformed from a momentary pastime for many to a form of identity for a generation. People live for this shit, and I'm no different. But just like everything else in my brain space, it can't be as simple as I listen, I like, I love. No, it's always, how does this make me feel while I'm making the sandwich? Or what 1:45 a.m. scenario does this song pair well with? You know, the shit that generally gives a bad case of unbeknownst secondhand embarrassment at work the next day. At the worst moment, since there's now like 3 people looking at me while I randomly start making faces at them like I smelled last week's dinner from the other side of the room. It's generally this train of thought that makes me know when I've struck gold, or something special for me at least. Well, at least not at first, but songs you grow to like never stick at first. And I mean that unironically, sadly, because, and I'm ready to die on this hill, this is the best album of the 90s and they didn't even know it. So without further ado, the best album of the 90s is, you've seen the title, it's Emergency&I. But before that, I like to apologize. In my first video, I gave off, or at least tried to anyway, the appearance of a respectable critic, a music elitist, a highbrow consumer, if you will. That is not the case. I'm a normal dude with conflicting tastes who likes to fucking talk a lot, but not in an annoying child at the doctor's office with a semi-postpartum parent, but more like the guy from work who you swear has autism because he won't get a fucking clue. Maybe that, or a bathroom stall guy rambling. But that's not to everyone, and only when it connects to music. I'm not a nice person really, but I love music, so that should even things out. So with that being said, understand you're watching a show and tell and not like a music review, okay? Okay, so my favorite album of the 90s and the best of the overall decade, the previous video was a joke, but this is my real opinion, keep up Mark, is, I already introduced it. So there's this band called the Dismemberment Plan, and they make good music. The end. I wish it was that simple, and for a couple of years it was. The projects before their 99 masterpiece were varying levels of good, with the lo-fi but rough debut exclamation mark, or is it alert? I like to call it alert, but it has an exclamation mark with like 2 quotation marks. So let's just call it exclamation. And the more well-produced but nonetheless abrasive Dismemberment Plan is Terrified. And in these 2 albums, they established a more distinctive sound than most modern bands and artists do with a decade of work behind them. That sound being characterized by chaotic yet rhythmic chords and riffs, the blending of genres like jazz, punk, and sweet emo. But this is debatable because the larger overall scene was known as the DC hardcore, and the soft yet explosive harsh slacker vocals of Travis Morrison that carried a lot of the earlier music for me is a big part of the emo versus hardcore debate around them. But for the sake of not going down any rabbit holes and attracting overly type-happy audiophiles of the fucking late 90s DC hardcore scene, I'm positive they exist, we call them post-punk. They carved out a pretty nice spot for themselves in the DC landscape, and because of some truly unfortunate circumstances with the unrelated band, they were poised with their next album to take the niche raw sound they cultivated to the big leagues. So in 1999, or more accurately in 1998, Travis and the boys started production on what will become their magnum opus, an alternative amalgamation that blended elements of post-punk, jazz, pop, emo into one very special child. But in 1999, I couldn't walk or talk or breathe since I was 3 years removed from exiting my father and 4 years from my mom, and about 18 years from discovering this grail of existentialism and social indifference immediately after my Weezer phase, my Pinkerton Weezer phase. And as of now, I think they are my most played band. Let me check. Needless to say, I'm a fan, but it wasn't always like this. I actually found the band to be sonically weird and not Weezer enough, but later I got my brainwaves removed and gave it a second chance, at which it hit me like a sack of bricks. This is sonically weird, but that's a good thing. And I enjoyed them on a casual level for about a year until I turned the big 20. Now for context, I live in the Midwest and things tend to, at least from my experience, feel a bit lonesome or a little crowded. Living in a big city, heading into my 20s the same way in the same place as virtually the same person as I did when I was 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, with no expectations or urgency. Normally this would have been fine, but for some reason turning 20, my brain decided to flip the switch and go into full panic mode. The realization that I lived every year the same exact way was haunting for me. I was still the same, but everything around me was different, and the realization was terrifying. So if I had to describe the album, and not the band as a whole, just Emergency&I, it would be alone in my 20s, which could be a bad thing depending on who you are and what you do, but it's distinctively different from being lonely in my 20s, which is something I think we all can agree is a bad thing. Avoidance versus isolation. So when I say Emergency&I is the soundtrack to my life, I mean it in a less beginning to end sort of way, and more of a current state of things type of way. You get me? And not in all parts. I feel saying something like this always seems to make people assume the worst, but the album itself isn't all that sad or pessimistic. If anything, it's optimistic. And while the lyrical themes paint a vivid picture of a distant person, there's a silver lining that stings itself through each song for me. And that is, the world is ever changing, even if you're not. Giving the album a second chance was probably one of the best things I've ever done in my life. No hyperbole. No hyperbole. It was my first Goosebumps album. You know, like an album where you listen to something and then you just like get like goosebumps. It's very self-explanatory. It was my first Goosebumps album as an adult, one in which I could actually understand and relate to the themes and ideas that was being presented to me, all while it blares keyboards. Travis Morrison sings like he's on the verge of an epiphany or suicide. Emergency&I is the third album by the Dismemberment Plan. Unlike the band's other project, it has an actual fascinating conception and production history behind it. It was marked by creative exploration and the wanting of trying new sounds that unfortunately all took place during the most turbulent time in Travis' life. I assume with the simultaneous passing of his father and the birth of his nephew. Released in 1999, the album emerged during the time of significant transition for the band. They sought to break through conventional musical structures, which was never really their style, all while Interscope was looking for a replacement for their unrealized partnership with the short-lived but nonetheless brilliant Brainiac. To either fill a niche or to fill the hole that Kurt Cobain left not only in himself but the music industry that was tasteless was the goal in the venture, and it came at a perfect time because the band, with a history of embracing new sounds that was innovative and distinctively their own, utilizing different music styles, their new but short-lived partnership with Interscope primed them to make something timeless, and that's exactly what they did. In 1998, the band entered the studio with the vision to create music that was both experimental and emotionally resonant. With two legends of the DC hardcore scene in J.J. Robbins, most known for his work with his own projects like Jawbox and Burning Airlines, using his ability to blend sharp punk influences with polished production turned out to be a major factor in the production of this album. And another in Chad Clark, who most of you definitely don't know, just know he's a proven vet of the DC scene. They proved invaluable in achieving the vision, which was turning out to be less of a regular Dismemberment Plan project and more of a last hurrah from the DC hardcore scene. The album recording session took place within 3 weeks at the Water Music Studio in Hoboken, New Jersey. The D-Plan experimented with various music styles and unusual time signatures per usual, incorporating elements of punk, funk, and electronic music. This mix resulted in an album that was not only sonically adventurous, but was geared to set them apart from many of their contemporaries in the post-hardcore and emo scene of the late 90s. On October 26, 1999, the album boasts 12 tracks that span a quick 45 minutes. The album opens with its first track, A Life of Possibilities, which is an electric rhythmic romp paired with these lyrics that are filled with isolation and scornful judgment. The song is a clear allegory of life that brings to mind the imagery of a worm for me. I don't know why. And it sort of leans into the next track, Memory Machine, which is easily my personal favorite. There's so much untapped potential in it, but what it is still fucking amazing. And it's more like the first. It keeps up with that heavy electric rhythmic sound with the simple addition of some distortions and a very catchy bass line that creates the should-be anthem of the album that really feels like it brings the urgency to the sound. This moment here starts to build upon this portrait for me in my head that I'm watching sequences in someone's life before they quickly move on. Like the big track off the album, What Do You Want Me to Say? Giving a view into a perceived dysfunctional relationship, but despite how on the nose it seems, it's never really explicitly implied as a lover. We're hearing Travis's words, but we're living the moments out ourselves. It's even more apparent in the more somber moments of the album, like the jitters, the city, and the wonderfully ambient spider and the snow, that once again induced this feeling of living through thousands of regrets in a moment before it pans to the next anxiety attack. Girl O'Clock and the more intense 8.5 minutes do a great job of bringing more of that urgency on some of the more socially depressing moments, even if it's presented in a ha 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 type of way. The album does a great job at pacing itself too. It has a nice listening curve, but it's not without some snoozers. The Jitters, which is a moody atmospheric track that has that familiar D-plan feel and is full of some somber lyrics, but it feels joyless and disconnected from every other song around it. This was supposed to be the fun kind of depression, and the more frantic I Love a Magician, which is just very disjointed in my opinion. It's much more fun than the Jitters before it, but it still has to contend with the strong contention of better songs on the album, what makes it fall more towards the wayside. That's only two, and You're Invited comes around and picks back up the pace. It's a return of a tradition of pseudo spoken word songs that the band really good at. It has a really strong chorus and a story of acceptance that's vivid but falls flat on me because, like, why is he invited? Like, is he an asshole or is he somebody who just really need a victory? That's not to say that the song isn't without its merit though. Its usage of the drum machine was simple but effective, and the chorus is amazing. Sparingly used is the more electronic moments on this album, like the keyboard and previously mentioned drum machine. But whenever it makes its appearance, you feel every moment of it. Like with Gyroscope being this hypersonic dance anthem with the keyboard setting the tempo, and Well the City, which is the most emotionally powerful song off the album and is by far their best written song in their whole discography. It effortlessly invokes feelings of regret and loneliness and creates this mind imagery of a lived in but ugly city in the winter, but that could just be me. This was the moment I felt the most. It was here that I realized that I wasn't just listening to a good song, but I was experiencing true expression of feeling. This part of the album always lasts longer in my head than what it actually is, which is just a little over 4 minutes. This was the moment right here I felt the most. It was here that I realized that I wasn't just listening to a song, but experiencing true expression of feeling. Closing out the album is back and forth. Whenever perfect endings come up for any album, this has to be at the top of the list for me because if nothing else, it's most representative of what exactly the band set out to do with this project, sonically, lyrically, and conceptually. Opening up with this almost jazzy like dance vibe with math rock elements that's simple but effective as the lyrics hit you with this optimistic nihilism that feels like you're reading a suicide note written in gel pen covered in stickers that says LOL at the end, and it's an absolute jam. I really can't understate how strong of a showing this album really is. Like I said, it feels like a last stand for the DC hardcore scene, and looking back, if this is that, then this is one hell of a finale. I say that to say it's a real strong showcase of everything that's built up by not only the band but the producers behind it. And in the end, it's only 45 minutes. The anxiety-riddled manic panic episode ends with the same amount of abandon towards the world that it began with. That being a quality of the album I like very much, but one I feel that in time will become the only thing appreciated by some of the more lonesome listeners. I'll admit it, it's probably not the best album of the decade. I'll admit it now only because I've gotten you to watch so long, so I got my watch time. It's probably not the best of the 90s, probably, but it's definitely my favorite. It is one of the most uniquely innovative albums sonically to come from the decade. And while the themes and ideas presented are revolutionary by 90s standards, and if released today, it would definitely be competing with every fourth wave emo art album. It's less about what you say in the story than how the story is told, at least when it comes to being interesting. The sound can't be matched. It captures the stress-induced frightfulness that it set out to create in a real lightning in a bottle kind of way that manages to make all the on surface conflicting musical ideas come together in this powerful way that's ripe for appreciation in today's modern landscape. And in doing the minimum amount of web lurking I call research for this video, I found this 2011 article confirming just that on Ludditestereo. I think it's called Ludditestereo. Let's call it L Stereo. I'll put a link in the description. It sort of laments the album's lack of exposure in spite of the cultural relevance that indie rock enjoyed in the period following the album's release. And while I agree to an extent, it also makes sense to me why the album didn't immediately blow up to classic must-listen status. And to not go all social commentary on all you, but the world, and when I say the world, I mean America, was a lot more happy. And when I say happy, I mean in a bleak collective agreement. From my perspective at least, if you build a time machine and go back to like 2002, 2003 and ask people what was the biggest problems facing the American public and society, their answers are all going to be about the same. Now, after that little time machine excursion, you step outside and ask that same exact question, you're going to have 50 different answers from just 3 people. My point is, we're more openly disconnected from one another, despite always being connected to each other. And at our core, we know it's problematic. How does this relate to Dismemberment Plan's third album, Emergency&I? don't fucking know, but it relates to the core themes of isolation and indifference in the face of change. But I don't need to be the billionth person to pick at the blights of our modern society. And in my head, I said I would avoid doing just that. But what I found most interesting is in every subsequent review or slight mention of this album, social analysis always seems to be brought up, like an abusive girlfriend who's half fraud. It just can't be ignored. And to me, that's powerful. I don't think they set out to do that. Hell, I'm pretty sure Interscope would have loved nothing more than a Nirvana 2. And in a weird sort of way, they succeeded in that. 20 years later and on a way smaller scale. Like way small. Something so small that it even make people discuss. But despite that, here I am talking about them. I don't nerd out often and definitely not publicly for no other reason than to avoid being stigmatized. But eventually you grow up and while some of the more lingering problems only grow with age, the little shit-ups in life stop mattering as much and you find your enjoyment of something more important than what someone has to say about your love for said thing. And that's what this album is all about. Ultimately, you'll just have to let go because Lord knows the world has. Even if the people in your life or people you've hurt hasn't, you have to because the world itself has. The grass continues to grow, earth spins on, the sheets get washed, at least I fucking hope so. And you should strive for that same mentality. Or maybe you shouldn't because it meant something. Despite how meaningless it felt at the time or really was or wasn't or how you perceive it. It's those moments, thoughts, fears, and emotions that live on in you, whether you want them to or not. It's a memoir. Needless to say, I love this album and its strange sound paired with existentialist themes. It's a masterpiece in my eyes and one of those rare projects that set out to be something special and unique and managed to be just that. And while the albums after managed to keep the same quality with varying degrees of energy, they never managed to make Paranoia sound so comfortable.